Welcome to Political Science 200, Survey of Political Theory. This is our first lecture, and the topic is political theory and political science. We're going to discuss the definition of both, and we'll try to find the relationship between the two. Gotten ahead of myself. Instead of emphasis on the United States and American politics, what you will find is, if it's Germany, it would be German politics, or if it's the UK, it would be British politics. Everything else would be quite similar, okay? All right, so we can now go to the next part of this lecture, and we'll talk about history of political science. We can start by asking who was the first political scientist. That's as good a place as any to start. There's no one right answer to this question. I would say that among political scientists and historians, the most frequent answers to this question are the following three answers: Aristotle, Machiavelli, and Montesquieu, not necessarily in this order. So here's what happens. Different political scientists and historians emphasize different aspects of the field, and so that influences their answer to this question. Those who choose Aristotle do so because Aristotle was really the first great classifier of the different forms of government which he perceived to have existed in ancient Greece. And so those who emphasize importance of classifications and for whom systematic classifications are a nearly sufficient condition for a science, or at least the beginnings of science, they say, well, Aristotle was the originator of political science. So what Aristotle did was carefully classify constitutions of various city-states, and he identified different forms of government, which he separated into two broad categories: good forms of government and perverse forms of government. Then you have a second possible answer to the question, who was the first political scientist, is Niccolo Machiavelli. Well, why Machiavelli? Because Machiavelli emphasized separation of facts from values, and also the importance of consequentialist understanding of politics. So separation of facts from values means that you have to disentangle the two, otherwise you'll never have good analysis. And so that's a prerequisite for any science. Science is all about building up, starting from facts and proceeding from that to hypothesis, and then from that to hypothesis testing. And if you test your hypothesis and they're still valid, then you say, well, these are not just hypotheses, these are actually natural laws. And then you kind of come up with a general framework for those laws, and you call that a theory. So it's important, if you want to be scientific, to come to terms with the facts and not to try to muddy those with your values. You may not like the facts, you may not like the hypotheses that follow from those facts, but you're not at liberty to try to derail the facts and the hypothesis using your values. And this is what Machiavelli implies: separation of facts and values. And also his consequentialism, that in order to achieve certain consequences, you also have to utilize certain means. If you want certain ends, you must accept the necessity of certain means. So this consequentialist, no-nonsense, realistic approach to politics is what leads some political scientists and historians to identify Machiavelli as the first political scientist. And finally, we have Montesquieu as a possible answer. Montesquieu is renowned for his book, The History of the Laws, and he proposed a naturalistic description of how different governments come out of different geographical and cultural circumstances. So he's not just a classifier and not just an observer of governments and constitutions. He puts forth explanations, hypotheses for why certain governments flow from certain geographical and cultural circumstances. Montesquieu also proposed separation of powers into three distinct branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. and was, for this reason, extremely influential on the founders of the United States Constitution. Of course, the Constitution was written in 1787, that is to say, almost 2 generations after Montesquieu's death, and the founders knew about him, and many of them referred to Montesquieu as the illustrious Montesquieu. His name came up frequently during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, so he was really influential in the course of American and world history. Sometimes Thucydides is actually given as an answer for us political scientists. There may be some other possible infrequent answers, but these tend to be Aristotle, Machiavelli, and Montesquieu. Depending on who you ask, these tend to be the most frequent answers to the question. So, continuing with the history of political science, first departments of political science originated in the United States in the late 19th century, around 1879, and they were few and far between. Political science does not really come into its own as a discipline until the 20th century. In 1903, the American Political Science Association is established, and around that time, departments of political science begin to proliferate in universities across the country. So, and I would say that throughout the 20th century, American political science was probably more dominant than any other country's political science on the global stage, probably because of the sheer size and importance of the United States in world affairs, but also because of the greater resources of American universities. For example, one might say that American political science had greater impact on European political science than European political science had on American political science. So political science turns out to be a derivative science in that it focuses on the study of power, but in order to achieve that, it draws on a number of related social science disciplines, particularly on psychology, economics, sociology, and history. And over time, different disciplines have had greater or lesser impact. For example, during the behavioral revolution in political science in the 1950s and 1960s, political science heavily drew on on psychology. Behavioral psychology, as pioneered by John Watson and B.F. Skinner, with its emphasis on quantifiable, measurable things like behavior, because you can measure behavior, you can quantify it, and then put results into a computer. This turned out to be a very appealing approach across a number of social sciences, including political science. Economics was also very influential in the 1980s and 1990s, the area of political economy and international political economy, as political scientists drew on primarily quantitative models from economics and econometrics. And what economics contributes to political science is the relationship between wealth and power. Just like psychology contributed to the understanding between the psychology and behavior of particular leaders on one hand and policies on the other hand. Sociology is all about the study of groups in society, and political science drew also very heavily on sociology and class analysis, for example, because classes are nothing but groups that are arranged hierarchically. So from top to bottom, there are upper classes and middle classes, lower classes. So political science drew very heavily on that. And of course, history, because without some knowledge of history, current political events would be decontextualized, and it would be very difficult to understand their meaning even at the basic level. History gives us the context and the structure, and so many political scientists inevitably teach history, even though they may try to teach politics as much as possible. Without some knowledge and presentation of history, political science makes little sense. So I would say that these have been the primary sources of inspiration and ideas and data on which political science drew and continues to draw. Political science has also been heavily influenced by the proliferation of personal computers. I mentioned that when I mentioned behavioral psychology. So since the 1950s and 60s and the proliferation of mainframes, and then escalating in the 1980s and 1990s with the proliferation of personal computers, quantitative methods became increasingly appealing because you could store and statistically analyze vast quantities of data in order to try to see patterns and then hopefully form testable hypotheses based on those patterns. All areas of fields of political science, among all areas of fields of political science, political theory is the oldest and the most traditional one, the one that is least separated from philosophy and the one that's least quantitative. Political philosophy is very much a part of what we do in political theory. And for practical purposes, the difference between political theory and political philosophy is blurred. In actuality, what you would want to do is to get to the point where theory, in political theory, is actually extremely tightly connected to reality. But I'm not sure that we are there yet. So if you think about science, like I said, in science, theory is a general framework for scientific laws. And when we talk about Newtonian mechanics or classical mechanics, that's a theory that encompasses 4 laws of Newton, among which you find 3 laws of motion, 1 law of gravity, and then everything that follows from it. So the name for the general framework of that is, theoretical mechanics, Newtonian mechanics. Or if you take the theory of evolution, it's a general framework for the explanation of how speciation happens, how different varieties of life are generated. So there are mutations, and there are genetic mutations, although originally the word genetic wasn't there, as Darwin did not understand about genes, but he did understand that there were mutations, and the mutations were random, and then some mutations died out, the majority of them, but some did better than the existing species. And so under pressure of different selection, some survived, mutations survived and proliferated, and others have died out. So what we are talking about here, when we talk about theory of evolution, is just a framework for that. And then you can talk about theory of thermodynamics, which encompasses the laws of thermodynamics. So theory is the most generalized possible framework or explanation or package that holds together scientific laws. And if you look at theory of games, for example, in chess or checkers or Go, what is theory? Well, theory is a generalized sum total of practice. So you say, this is the main theoretical line. It means that practice has shown that you get the best results playing this line. So again, just like in science, theory is immediately connected to practice. But in political theory, you have the mingling, I would say, between actual practice and speculation. And in this regard, political theory can also be called political philosophy. Okay. At the same time, philosophy in recent centuries, starting, I would say, with John Locke and Francis Bacon in England, and continuing on to, well, let's say, the work of Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, and on to the Vienna Circle, philosophy became much more committed to no-nonsense factual and logical analysis, and trying to avoid excessive, if any, reference to speculation and metaphysics. So philosophy has really developed this sensitivity to being relevant. And if you want to be relevant, you cannot separate yourself from facts. So as over recent 4 centuries, philosophy became more connected to facts, and it became a little bit more like theory in this regard. While at the same time, political theory hasn't really graduated to being theory in the scientific sense. And what you have is really political theory and political philosophy being 2 different names for essentially the same thing. The formal distinction is that, of course, political theory belongs to political science departments, and political philosophy belongs to philosophical departments. But that's a formal distinction, not a substantive one. Okay, so what we have here is political theory has been and remains the least quantitative area of field of political science. American politics, the most quantitative one. In recent decades, political theory has been dominated by postmodern, deconstructionist, feminist, and postcolonial, and also ethnic studies. Let me say just a few words about this. So, postmodern influences are those that try to go beyond not traditional, but beyond the postulates and values of the Enlightenment. So if the Enlightenment is synonymous with modernity and is based on the idea of rationality and progress, then postmodernism tends to emphasize lack of rationality, that is to say, non-rational and irrational sides of human nature, and also the differences in perspective that come from different circumstances and different beings. So there are many perspectives. Therefore, there are many kinds of truths, and not a single truth, as Enlightenment tended to postulate. So postmodernism is very close in meaning to perspectivalism, to post-Enlightenment. Deconstructionism is similar in this regard, often associated with the work of Jacques Derrida, and it's all about how language and ideas, when taken apart, reveal a lot of concealed assumptions and prejudices, and how we are driven sometimes unconsciously or subconsciously by our certain commitments and presumptions of our language and the categories of thought that come from that. Feminism emphasizes the importance of women as a distinct group in society, their own perspectives, their own interests and experiences. Post-colonial perspective is all about the regions of the world that have been decolonized since the collapse of European colonial empires in the 20th century, primarily between 1947 and the late 1960s, when the remaining vast empires of the United Kingdom and France dissolved, creating many new governments in many new countries. And the emphasis here is on the unique experience of people and cultures that had been colonized by the Europeans. Ethnic studies, all about the experiences of particular ethnic groups. So as you can see, this type of political theory is united by the idea of uniqueness, subjectivity, and perspectivalism. This doesn't mean that scholars who work in these currents, these intellectual currents, that they do not use empirical data, because of course they do use empirical data, and of course they do use rational arguments in order to reach their conclusions, but what is being discussed here is the variety of beings and the variety of cultures and experiences producing a variety of contending and equally legitimate points of view. Then the next point I want to make is to say that American politics continues to be, well into the 21st century, the most widespread field, certainly among undergraduate departments in the United States. The vast majority of states actually require students to take at least one course in American politics if they want to graduate. There's still a handful that do not, but most do. And then you have political theory. Like I mentioned before, it tends to be in the bottom in terms of the number of positions, political science positions that exist, and therefore you have the fewest number of political scientists and the smallest number of political science output coming from political theorists. I think that grand theorizing in recent decades has been denigrated, and there haven't been many political theorists who have enjoyed success. I do, however, want to point out that every once in a while there's kind of a blurring between political theory and another field. For example, the blurring between international relations and political theory. One could point to books like The End of History and the Last Man by Francis Fukuyama, which represents just such a blurring, or perhaps a better word would be blending of two fields. Fukuyama's work is inextricably philosophical in nature. It's very broad, it's very general and theoretical, but at the same time, it's about world relations. So it's a blend of international relations and political theory. And I would say the same for Samuel Huntington and his book, The Clash of Civilizations, written near the end of the 20th century. That too represents the same type of blending in international politics and political theory. But generally speaking, political theorists enjoy less of a status, I would say, in political science because they're seen as being too generic, coming up with generalizations that do not reflect the complexity, the detail, and the facts on the ground. And the modern world really likes to have abundance of details, abundance of specifics, which political theory generally does not provide. So this was our first lecture, and hope it was at least marginally enlightening, and I will see you in the next one.